In a notary's office in Roswell, New Mexico, on the 26th of December 2002, an 80-year-old man named Walter Haut signed his name on the last page of a typed affidavit. Before he signed it, he asked that the document be sealed. The affidavit was 3 pages long, 12 numbered paragraphs, witnessed by a notary public and by Haut's own daughter, Julie Schuster. The document was not to be opened while he was alive. Walter Haut died on the 15th of December 2005. The seal was broken not long after, and in paragraph 8, a retired United States Air Force public information officer described in plain administrative English the interior of a B-29 hangar at Roswell Army Air Field on the 8th of July 1947. He gave the building a number, IC Mamiya, Building 84. Inside it, he wrote, there was an egg-shaped craft, about 15 feet long, and there were several bodies, each one approximately 4 feet tall. Haut was not a stranger to that hangar. In July of 1947, he had been a 25-year-old first lieutenant, the public information officer of the 509th Bombardment Group, the same man who, on the same morning the bodies were allegedly inside that hangar, had drafted the press release that placed the words "flying saucer" on the front page of the Roswell Daily Record. For 55 years afterward, he repeated the official line. The debris had been a weather balloon. The story had been a mistake. And then, in 2002, he sealed an affidavit and wrote down what he said he had actually seen. Tonight, fellow archivist, we are going to walk through this slowly. There are many documents. We will take them one at a time. The records have waited. We can take our time with them. Let us return to the year. Let us begin where the standard history begins. 1947. The United States is 2 years removed from the end of the Second World War. The atomic bomb is, in the summer of that year, still the most consequential secret in human history. And the only military unit in the world authorized to assemble, transport, and deliver a nuclear weapon to a target is stationed in the desert of southeastern New Mexico. The 509th Bombardment Group, commanded by Colonel William H. Blanchard. 12,000 personnel under his authority. 2 years earlier, this same unit had dropped the bombs on Hiroshima and Nagasaki. This matters. We have to start here. Because the place where the events of July 1947 unfolded is not a random airbase. It is the most strategically sensitive military installation on the North American continent. Everything that happens at Roswell that summer happens inside the security perimeter of the nuclear arsenal of the United States. There is one more piece of context to set before the first documents begin. In the month that preceded Walter Haut's press release, a new phrase had entered the American language. On the 24th of June, 1947, a civilian pilot named Kenneth Arnold reported seeing 9 objects flying in formation over the Cascade Range in Washington state. He described their motion to a reporter as resembling, in his own words, saucers skipped across water. A newspaper editor compressed the description into a phrase, flying saucers. Within 2 weeks, the phrase had taken hold across the country. Sightings were being reported in nearly every state of the Union. The country was, in a literal sense, looking up. This is the world into which the Roswell story is born. A post-war country, atomic-armed, 2 years into the nuclear age, hearing for the first time the phrase flying saucer in the morning newspapers. Now, consider the date. The 14th of June, 1947, or the 5th, or the 6th. The witnesses themselves disagree on the exact day. What is not disputed is that sometime in mid-June, the foreman of a sheep ranch in Lincoln County, New Mexico, a man named William W. Brazel, known to everyone simply as Mac, rode out across the high desert pasture northwest of Roswell and found something on the ground that he could not identify. The ranch was the J.B. Foster Sheep Ranch, roughly 75 miles northwest of the town of Roswell. The land was open, sparsely grazed. The country, in any direction, was empty for miles. There were no paved roads. Brazel was alone. He gathered some of the material into a pile and continued his work. He did not return to it immediately. According to his own interview given to the Roswell Daily Record, on the 9th of July 1947, the day after the press release, he had been busy with sheep. The debris remained in the pasture for some weeks. When he came back to it, he gathered more of it. He took some of it home. His wife and his children examined what he had brought. It is here in the second week of July that the story enters the federal record. On the 6th of July 1947, Mac Brazel drove into the town of Roswell with samples of the material in the bed of his pickup truck. He went directly to the office of Sheriff George A. Wilcox of Chaves County. He showed the sheriff what he had found. The sheriff, in turn, telephoned the Roswell Army Air Field. By the following morning, 2 officers from the field had been dispatched to the Foster Ranch. The first was Major Jesse A. Marcel, the intelligence officer of the 509th Bombardment Group. The second was Captain Sheridan Cavett of the Counterintelligence Corps. They accompanied Brazel back across the 75 miles of dirt road to the pasture. They walked the debris field, which, according to Marcel's later testimony, extended for several hundred yards. They collected what was there. By the evening of the 7th, the material had been moved to the base. What happened next is recorded in 3 independent contemporaneous documents. The first is the front page of the Roswell Daily Record of the 8th of July, 1947. The full transcription is preserved on Wikisource. The microfilm is held in the University of New Mexico Center for Southwest Research. The headline reads, RIAF captures flying saucer on ranch in Roswell region. The article quotes the intelligence office of the 509th Bombardment Group at noon that day, confirming that the field had come into possession of a flying disc. The second document is the press release itself, written and distributed on the orders of Colonel Blanchard by First Lieutenant Walter G. Haut, the same man who, 55 years later, would sign the sealed affidavit. The release went out over the wire services, Associated Press, United Press. It was hand-delivered to the 2 local radio stations, KGFL and KSWS. The wire copy is reproduced in the National Archives microfilm of the Project Blue Book holdings. The third document is a teletype, sent on the same day, the 8th of July 1947, from the Dallas field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The teletype is preserved at the FBI Vault, the Bureau's public declassified archive at Vault, FBI Gov. It confirms, in the administrative shorthand of the Bureau, that the Army Airfield at Roswell has reported the recovery of a disc-shaped object. 3 documents, 3 institutions, the local newspaper, the military's own press apparatus, the Federal Investigative Agency, all 3 on the same day describing a recovered flying disc. By the evening of the 8th of July, all 3 statements will have been retracted. This is the moment the story turns. Let us pause for a moment on the geography. The press release went out around noon. Within hours, the wire services had picked it up. Telephone lines into Roswell, by every contemporaneous account, were jammed. Newspapers across the country were preparing to run the story in the morning editions of the 9th. And somewhere in the headquarters of the 8th Air Force, in Fort Worth, Texas, a brigadier general named Roger M. Ramey was already on the telephone. By mid-afternoon, the material recovered from the Foster Ranch was loaded onto an aircraft at Roswell. It was flown to Fort Worth Army Air Field, the home of the 8th Air Force. There, in General Ramey's office, the debris was laid out on the floor. A star photographer from the Fort Worth Star-Telegram, a 23-year-old man named J. Bond Johnson, was summoned to the building. He brought his speed graphic camera. He photographed what was on the floor. Those photographs are the only known visual record of the material that was recovered from the Foster Ranch on the 7th of July, 1947. The original negatives are held today by the University of Texas at Arlington Libraries in their Fort Worth Star-Telegram collection. The catalogue entry can be found at Library, Utah Edu, under the Roswell Project. The images show General Ramey crouched on the floor of his office, holding pieces of what appears to be foil and balsa wood framework. In another image from the same session, Major Jesse Marcel himself, the intelligence officer who had walked the debris field the day before, kneels on the floor of the office next to the same material. He is in his uniform. He is holding a piece of the recovered material in his right hand. His expression is difficult to read. In one of the photographs taken that afternoon, General Ramey holds a piece of paper in his hand. A telex, folded once. The text is partially visible. That telex has never been conclusively transcribed. We will come back to it. But the photograph that mattered, on the evening of the 8th of July 1947, was a different image. General Ramey, standing in his office in front of the assembled press, declared that the material on the floor was the wreckage of a Rowan weather tracking target, a radar reflector. He held a piece of foil up to the cameras. He smiled. He answered questions. By the morning of the 9th of July, the headlines across the United States had been corrected. The flying saucer was a weather balloon. The 509th Bombardment Group had been mistaken. Mac Brazel was photographed in the office of the Roswell Daily Record, surrounded by pieces of foil and balsa wood, repeating for the record that what he had found was a weather device. By the time that photograph was taken, the rancher had spent the better part of a week in military custody. The same Daily Record account describes him as accompanied to the office by an army major, reluctant to speak about what he had found beyond the new official position. Brazel would not return to the press for the rest of his life. He died in 1963 in the town of Tularosa, New Mexico, having refused, by every surviving account, to revisit the events of that July. And there the story sat in the official record for the next 31 years. This is the standard history. This is what the textbook said for a generation. This is the timeline that, until February of 1978, almost no professional historian had a reason to question. Let us hold that timeline for a moment. The press release at noon, the retraction at dusk, the country going to bed believing that a weather balloon had been mistaken for a flying saucer in the desert outside Roswell, New Mexico. And let us also hold this. The General Accounting Office of the United States, in a report dated the 28th of July 1995, document number NSIID 95187, made a discovery while attempting to reconstruct the chain of custody of the materials recovered that week in 1947. The audit had been requested 2 years earlier by Representative Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, after his own letters to the Pentagon had received no useful response. The report is public. It is hosted today at GIO.gov. The relevant paragraph is brief. It states that the administrative records of the 509th Bombardment Group, covering the period from March 1945 through December 1949, had been destroyed. The outgoing message logs of the same unit, covering October 1946 through December 1949, had also been destroyed. There was no record of when these documents were destroyed. There was no record of who had authorized their destruction. There was no record of the disposal authority under which the destruction had been conducted. A military unit's paper trail for the entire window of years that includes both the use of the atomic bomb against 2 cities and the events of July 1947 had been removed from the archive. We do not know by whom. We do not know when. We do not know why. Now let us go back to the desert outside Roswell in the summer of 1947, and let us ask very patiently what was supposed to be there. In the summer of 1947, the United States was running a classified atmospheric research program out of Alamogordo Army Air Field in New Mexico, approximately 100 miles southwest of Roswell. The program had a name, Project Mogul. The purpose of Project Mogul, known at the time only to a small circle within the Army Air Forces and the Office of Naval Research, was to detect Soviet atomic tests. The means by which it proposed to do this was unusual. A train of high-altitude weather balloons, linked together by long lengths of cordage, carrying along their length a string of microphones designed to listen for the low-frequency acoustic signatures that a nuclear detonation would produce in the upper atmosphere. The balloons were not ordinary balloons, they were polyethylene. The radar reflectors attached to them were not ordinary reflectors. They were constructed of balsa wood and foil-coated paper, designed and manufactured by the Mogul team at New York University. This is the program that, in the spring of 1994, the United States Air Force formally identified as the source of the Roswell debris. Now let us slow down on this, because the official position of the United States government, as it stands today, is built almost entirely on Project Mogul and on the testimony of one man. The 1994 report was prepared at the direction of Secretary of the Air Force Sheila Widnall, in response to the General Accounting Office audit we have already mentioned. The report was titled, in full administrative dryness, the Roswell Report, Fact versus Fiction in the New Mexico Desert. It was authored by Colonel Richard Weaver and Lieutenant James McAndrew. It runs to nearly 1,000 pages. The bulk of the volume is not analysis, it is annexes, interviews, maps of balloon trajectories, procurement records for the polyethylene material, photographs of the kind of radar reflector that the report claims was misidentified. The central technical witness for that report was a man named Charles B. Moore. In the summer of 1947, Charles Moore was a 27-year-old graduate student at New York University, working under the meteorologist Athelstan Spilhaus on the Mogul project. He launched balloons from Alamogordo. He took the data. He kept the launch logs. By the early 1990s, those logs and his own memory were among the few surviving primary sources from the project. He would go on to become a professor of atmospheric physics at the New Mexico Institute of Mining and Technology, where he worked until his death in 2010. Moore's contribution to the Mogul attribution was specific. He identified what he believed to be the most likely candidate. NYU Flight 4 launched, according to his reconstruction, on the 4th of June, 1947. He calculated from period wind data that the flight could have terminated in the general area of the Foster Ranch. He produced a map of its trajectory. He matched, point by point, the materials of a Mogul balloon train against the descriptions of the debris given by Marcel and others. This testimony, more than any other single source, became the official explanation. There is something important to say here, before we go further. Charles Moore was, by every account, a serious scientist. He had no apparent motive to misrepresent the record. He believed what he was saying. The Air Force report in its 1997 follow-up volume, titled The Roswell Report, Case Closed, went on to address the body witness accounts by attributing them to the recovery of anthropomorphic parachute test dummies dropped from high-altitude balloons in a series of programs called High Dive and Excelsior. You can read both reports in full. The 1994 version is held by the National Archives. The 1997 version is archived as Project Gutenberg ebook number 63659, available online today at Gutenberg.org. They are public documents. But here is what almost no one notices when they read them. The High Dive and Excelsior dummy drops did not begin until 1953. Some of the most cinematic of them were not conducted until 1959. The Roswell witness accounts of small bodies in or near the debris date to July of 1947. 6 years separates the earliest possible source of the official explanation from the events the explanation is meant to explain. The Air Force report acknowledges this discrepancy in a footnote. The report's explanation for the discrepancy is that the human memory, over the course of 40 or 50 years, may have telescoped events together, that the witnesses recalling in the 1980s and 1990s what they had seen in 1947 may have inadvertently merged into the Roswell story events they had heard about later from the dummy programs. This is a serious claim. It is also, in the experience of historians who deal with first-person memory, an unusual one. Memory does compress over time. Witnesses do conflate, but the body witness accounts at Roswell are not vague. They include named buildings, they include named officers, they include specific medical and biological details. The Air Force position is that despite this specificity, dozens of independent witnesses all happen to retroactively insert into their memories of one specific week in July 1947 events that occurred in 1953, 1954, 1955, 1957, and 1959. It is possible. The Air Force report says so. We will come back to whether it is likely. Now let us hold one more piece of the official explanation in our hand before we move on. The Project Mogul attribution rests, as we have said, on the testimony of Charles Moore and on the launch records that Moore was able to reconstruct in the early 1990s. But there is a question about those records that has never been fully resolved. The original launch logs for NYU Flight 4, the specific balloon train that the Air Force identifies as the most likely candidate for the Roswell debris, are not in the National Archives. They are not in the Air Force Historical Research Agency at Maxwell. They are not, by Moore's own statement, in any institutional archive at all. They were, according to the documentary record, lost. Moore's reconstruction is based on his personal memory of the launch, on the assumption that the cancelled flight number 4 was actually flown, and on weather data from the period. There is a separate document, a flight log preserved in the meteorology records of NYU's Atmospheric Research Department, which records that the flight numbered 4 was cancelled, not flown. There is correspondence between members of the Mogul team, dated June 1947, which is consistent with the position that the flight was cancelled. The skeptical investigator Carl Flock, in his 2001 book Roswell, Inconvenient Facts and the Will to Believe, accepts the Mogul attribution but acknowledges the documentation problem. The investigators Kevin Randall and Donald Schmidt argue that the documentation problem is, in fact, a falsification. Charles Moore, asked about this question repeatedly in interviews from the mid-1990s onward, maintained that the cancellation notation was a clerical error and that the flight had in fact been launched. This is the state of the evidence on the official explanation, a reconstruction by one witness, surviving documents that, at face value, suggest the flight was cancelled, the witness's position that the documents are mistaken, and an Air Force report that accepts the witness's position. Let us pause for a moment on what this means. The standard history of the Roswell incident, as told today on government websites, in mainstream encyclopedias, in the AARO Historical Record Report Volume 1, published in 2024, rests on a chain of inference that, at its base, comes down to one man's memory and his interpretation of one set of partially surviving records. That man was a serious scientist. He may well have been correct. But it is worth noting before we go any further that the official explanation is not built on physical evidence. There is no surviving piece of Project Mogul Flight 4. There is no surviving photograph of it being launched. There is no contemporaneous flight log establishing that it was flown. There is testimony, there is calculation, there is inference. This is not by itself a reason to reject the explanation. Inference is how history is done. But it is a reason to be careful when comparing the official explanation against the witness statements on the other side of the ledger. Let us hold all of this lightly. We have not yet come to the part of the record that troubles even the skeptics. Now let us return to the morning of the 8th of July, 1947, and ask a different question. Not what fell on the Foster Ranch, but what was the press release supposed to do? By every protocol known to military public affairs procedure in 1947, the announcement that the Roswell Army Air Field had recovered a flying disc was unprecedented. It was unauthorized in the sense that no broader Army Air Force's public affairs office had cleared the language. It was issued by a junior officer on the orders of a colonel regarding the security perimeter of the only atomic-armed combat unit in the world. It was sent out over commercial wire services on a Tuesday afternoon with no apparent chain of consultation up the command structure. This is, on its face, a strange thing for a colonel to authorize. We have in the surviving record no direct testimony from Colonel William Blanchard about why he authorized it. Blanchard died in 1966 in the office of the Vice Chief of Staff of the Air Force, having ascended to the rank of 4-star general. He left, by all surviving accounts, no memoir, no diary, no interview on the subject. What we have instead is the testimony of two people who served under him. Although Walter Haut, who wrote the release, told essentially the same story for 55 years before he sealed his final affidavit. Blanchard called him into the office that morning, handed him the language, told him to take it to the 2 radio stations and to the 2 newspapers in town. The directive came from Blanchard personally. Haut did not ask why. He did not ask whether the language had been cleared. He typed the release, distributed it, and went to lunch. The other testimony comes from Brigadier General Thomas Dubose, who in July of 1947 was a colonel and the Chief of Staff of the 8th Air Force under Brigadier General Ramey. Dubose was, by his own later affidavit signed in 1991, the officer who took the telephone call from Major General Clements McMullen at the Pentagon on the morning of the 8th of July. The call, according to Dubose's affidavit, directed that the Roswell material be flown to Fort Worth, that a cover story be prepared, and that the actual material be subsequently moved to Wright Field in Ohio. Dubose stated, under oath, that the weather balloon explanation was, in his words, a cover story. The Dubose affidavit, signed in September of 1991, is one of the documents that did not exist when the 1994 Air Force report was written. It was published by the Center for UFO Studies and is held in the Hynek Center archive in Chicago. Dubose was, at the time he signed it, 89 years old. He died the following year. He had retired from the Air Force as a brigadier general in 1959. He had no apparent reason to sign such a document late in life beyond the one stated reason. He wanted to correct the record before he died. So we have 2 distinct accounts of what happened on the 8th of July 1947 inside the 8th Air Force command structure, the official one, and the one given, under oath, by the Chief of Staff who had been in the room. Now let us consider one more piece of context before we move into the harder evidence. In the months immediately following the events at Roswell, a memorandum was prepared at the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. It was dated the 23rd of September 1947. It was signed by Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining, the commanding general of the Air Materiel Command. It was addressed to Brigadier General George Shulgin at the Pentagon. Its subject line was AMC opinion concerning flying discs. The memorandum is preserved today in Record Group 341 at the National Archives and is reproduced in the Project Sign files of Project Blue Book. The Twining memo is a calm, administrative document. It is not sensational. It does not make claims about extraterrestrial origin. What it does is, in numbered paragraphs, lay out the operating assumptions of the Air Materiel Command regarding the flying disc phenomenon, as of 2.5 months after the Roswell events. In paragraph 2, Twining writes, and I am giving you the language as it appears in the declassified original, that the phenomenon reported is something real and not visionary or fictitious. In paragraph 5, he describes the operational characteristics: metallic or light-reflecting surface, absence of trail, circular or elliptical shape, several reports of well-kept formation flights, evasive maneuvers indicating manual, automatic, or remote control. In paragraph 9, he writes that the phenomenon may have originated from a domestic source, or it may not have. This is a peculiar document. It is the opinion of the highest-ranking technical command in the United States Air Force, 2.5 months after the Roswell events, treating the existence of disc-shaped flying objects as an operating assumption. The memo would, 3 months later, lead directly to the establishment of Project Sign, the first official Air Force UFO investigation program. Project Sign would, in 1949, become Project Grudge. Project Grudge would, in 1952, become Project Blue Book. Project Blue Book would, between 1952 and 1969, accumulate the 12,618 case files that are held today at the National Archives. Consider the date of the Twining memo, the 23rd of September, 1947. 2.5 months after the official position of the United States Air Force had been that the Roswell debris was a weather balloon. 2.5 months after the press releases had been corrected, the wire services had been retracted, and the country had been told to go home. And here in this internal memo, the highest-ranking command in the Air Force describes the phenomenon as real, as an operating problem, as something that justified the creation of a permanency investigative program. 2 parallel records were being kept. We can see them both now. We could not see them then. Let us hold that thought. Now let us turn from the institutional records to the men who handled the material, because the most stubborn thing in the entire Roswell archive is not the documents. It is the witnesses. And of the witnesses, the one who has anchored the case for 40 years is Major Jesse Marcel. Marcel, in July of 1947, was the senior intelligence officer of the 509th Bombardment Group at the Roswell Army Air Field. He was, at that moment, the senior intelligence officer attached to the only nuclear-armed combat unit on the planet. He had flown 32 combat missions in the Pacific. He held the rank of major. He had been cleared for the atomic weapons program. He was not, by any reading of his service record, a man given to fanciful invention. In the immediate aftermath of the 8th of July 1947, Marcel was photographed at Fort Worth Army Air Field, kneeling beside what appeared to be a torn piece of foil-backed paper and a thin stick of balsa-like material. The photograph was taken by J. Bon Johnson, the staff photographer for the Fort Worth Star-Telegram. Bon Johnson's original negatives are held today at the University of Texas at Arlington Library's Special Collections. You can view them online at Library Utah, EduC Roswell. There are 6 photographs in the Bon Johnson set. They are, to this day, the only known visual record of the events of that afternoon in General Ramey's office. They show 4 men. They show various pieces of debris on the carpet. They show, in 2 of the frames, General Ramey holding what appears to be a folded telex message in his hand. The visible text of that telex has been the subject of high-resolution photographic analysis since 1998, primarily by the independent researcher David Rudiak and the UTA archive itself. It has never been conclusively transcribed. The words that some analysts have suggested are visible include phrases such as victims of the wreck and the disc, but no peer-reviewed transcription has been published. The telex remains today partially legible and fully contested. What we do have, unambiguously, are the photographs themselves, and we have Marcel's testimony about what those photographs show. Marcel said repeatedly and in writing that the material in the Bond-Johnson photographs was not the material he had brought from the Foster Ranch. He said this for the first time, publicly, in February of 1978. The interview took place in his home in Houma, Louisiana. The interviewer was Stanton Friedman, a nuclear physicist who had spent the better part of a decade tracking down rumors of a 1947 crash recovery. The recording of that conversation is preserved today in the Stanton Friedman papers at the University of New Brunswick archives, where Friedman deposited his complete files before his death in 2019. What Marcel said on that recording is that the material he had handled in the first week of July of 1947 was not, in his professional judgment, of terrestrial manufacture. He described it specifically, a foil that, when crumpled, would return to its original shape without a crease line. Strips of structural material, light as balsa, that could not be cut, dented, burned, or scratched. Symbols on the inner surface of those strips that resembled, in his description, characters of writing, but were not the characters of any alphabet he recognized. He said he had driven home on the night of the 7th of July, with samples of the material in the trunk of his car, because he wanted his wife and his 11-year-old son to see what he had found. He said he had laid the material out on the kitchen floor of their home in Roswell. He said the family had looked at it together in the warm kitchen light before he had returned to the base the next morning. This account is corroborated by his son. Dr. Jesse Marcel Jr. became an ear, nose, and throat surgeon. He served in Iraq as a flight surgeon with the Montana Army National Guard. He gave his own account of the kitchen floor incident in interviews beginning in 1991 and at book length in 2009 in The Roswell Legacy, published by Career Press. He was, in July of 1947, 11 years old. He remembered the kitchen floor. He remembered the beam material. He remembered, specifically, the symbols on the inside surface of one of the I-beam fragments. He drew them from memory, in interviews and in his book. We have in the public record 2 witnesses, father and son, separated in time by 31 years, and in geography by thousands of miles, giving the same physical description of material that they both said they had touched in the first week of July 1947. Marcel Sr. died in 1986. He never changed his account. He gave it under oath in deposition. He gave it on television. He gave it in writing, in private correspondence, in public lectures. He was asked, every time, whether he was certain that what he had handled was not a weather balloon. He answered, every time, that he had been a trained intelligence officer, that he had handled weather balloons in the course of his duties, and that the material from the Foster Ranch was not a weather balloon. Now here is what we need to weigh. Marcel may have been mistaken. Intelligence officers in 1947 were not, as a class, trained metallurgists. The material may have looked unfamiliar to him without being unearthly. The standard reply from this skeptical position, articulated most clearly by Carl Flock in his 2001 book, Roswell. Inconvenient Facts and the Will to Believe, is that Marcel sincerely believed what he was saying, but was working from the limited reference frame of a Pacific Theatre intelligence officer with no particular expertise in upper atmosphere balloon materials. This is a serious reply. It is in principle defensible, but it does not address the second part of his testimony. The second part of his testimony is that the material that ended up in the Bond-Johnson photographs was not the material he had brought from the ranch, that a substitution had occurred. That weather balloon debris had been brought into General Ramey's office to be photographed, while the actual Roswell material was elsewhere. This is a different kind of claim. It is not a claim about the unfamiliarity of a substance. It is a claim about an act of substitution, performed in a specific room, on a specific afternoon, corroborated, as we have already seen, by the chief of staff who was in that room. Marcel maintained this claim for the rest of his life. He maintained it in his 1978 interview with Friedman. He maintained it in his 1979 interview with Bob Pratt for the National Enquirer. He maintained it in the depositions he gave for the writers of the Roswell Incident, the 1980 book by Charles Berlitz and William Moore that first brought the story to a national audience and, more than any other single publication, reopened the case. You can choose, as the Air Force does, to set Marcel's testimony aside. You can argue that he was self-aggrandizing, that the National Enquirer is not a reliable venue, that he conflated over 30 years the unfamiliar with the unearthly. These arguments have been made. They have been made carefully by serious skeptics in serious books, but they do not erase the testimony. The testimony is still in the archive, in the archival. Let us hold that thought and turn now to one more document, because we are nearing the part of the record that is hardest to set aside. In the records of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in the file series held today at the FBI vault, there is a memorandum dated the 22nd of March 1950. It is a single page. It is signed by Guy Hottel, the special agent in charge of the FBI Washington Field Office. It is addressed to Director J. Edgar Hoover. Its subject line reads, "Flying Saucers." The Hottel memo is today one of the most downloaded documents in the entire FBI public archive. You can read it at vault.fbi.gov. It is 3 paragraphs long. In those 3 paragraphs, Hottel reports to Hoover that an Air Force investigator had told him that 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico. Each saucer, the memo states, was approximately 50 feet in diameter. Each saucer was occupied by 3 bodies of, in the memo's exact language, human shape but only 3 feet tall. The bodies were dressed in metallic cloth of a very fine texture. Each body, the memo says, was bandaged in a manner similar to the way a high-altitude flying suit is fitted. The FBI's public commentary on the Hottel memo today is that the report was sent up the chain, that the source of the information could not be confirmed, that no further investigation was conducted, and that the document is preserved in the archive as an example of the kind of report that crossed Hoover's desk in the early years of the flying disc phenomenon. This is the Bureau's position. It is a careful one, but notice what it does not say. It does not say that the report was investigated and found false. It does not say that the source was identified and discredited. It does not say that the New Mexico recoveries described in the memo did not occur. It says, in essence, that the document was filed and that nobody followed up. There is a peculiarity here that we should hold on to. Hoover's FBI in 1950 was not in the habit of filing unverified rumours of 3 crashed flying saucers and the bodies of 3-foot-tall occupants without further action. The Bureau under Hoover was institutionally obsessed with documentation. Unverified rumours were investigated, traced, refuted in writing, and the refutation was put into the file. The Hottel memo is unusual not because it exists. It is unusual because nothing was written after it. The dates here are worth noticing. March of 1950 is 2.5 years after Roswell. It is also 8 months after the Soviet Union's first successful atomic test, conducted in August of 1949. It is the year that the United States military intelligence community is reorganizing under the newly established Air Force, under the still young Central Intelligence Agency, under the structures created by the National Security Act of 1947. The year of the Hottel memo is the year the secrecy architecture of the early Cold War is being built, and in that year, this document is filed, and nothing happens after it. Now let us hold this together. We have the Twining memo of September 1947. We have the Chief of Staff affidavit we examined a moment ago. We have the Marcel testimony, sustained for 40 years across 2 generations. We have the Hottel memo of March 1950. We have the destroyed RAF records identified by the General Accounting Office in 1995. We have the press release of the 8th of July 1947, which contradicted itself before sundown. And we have, set against all of that, a 1994 Air Force report that attributes the debris to a balloon program whose primary surviving documentation suggests that the flight in question was cancelled. It is possible to read these documents and conclude that nothing happened. It is possible to read these documents and conclude that something happened, and that what happened was a routine recovery of a top-secret balloon train, and that the surrounding mythology accreted over 40 years from the imperfect memories of honest witnesses. It is also possible to read these documents and conclude something else. We're not going to tell you which conclusion to reach. We're going to keep reading. But before we keep reading, let us note one detail in the Hottel memo that does not get enough attention. The memo describes the bodies as human-shaped but only 3 feet tall. That is a specific phrase. It is not the kind of phrase you reach for to describe an animal. It is not the kind of phrase you reach for to describe a piece of equipment. It is the kind of phrase you reach for when you are trying, in administrative prose, to describe something that you cannot otherwise classify. And it is almost the same phrase, almost word for word, that turns up in the witness statements that begin to surface, beginning in the late 1980s, from people who claim to have served at the Roswell Army Air Field in the summer of 1947. Witnesses who, like Marcel, had spent most of their adult lives saying nothing. Witnesses who, like Dubose, waited until the end of their lives to put a sworn signature on what they had seen. Those statements are the part of the record that the Air Force, in its 1997 follow-up report, attempted to explain through the dummy program. We will take them up next. The witness statements began to surface, slowly and unevenly, beginning in the late 1980s. This is itself a fact worth pausing on. The Roswell events occurred in July of 1947. The first nationally circulated book on the subject, The Roswell Incident by Charles Berlitz and William Moore, was published in 1980. That book contained Jesse Marcel's account and a small handful of other early interviews. Most of the witness statements that today form the core of the case, however, were not given until after 1987, 40 years after the event, by men and women in their 70s and 80s, many of them within 5 years of their own deaths. This is the period during which the affidavits were collected. Now let us be precise about what an affidavit in this context is. An affidavit is a written statement signed by the witness, sworn before a notary public, in which the witness attests that the contents are, to the best of their knowledge, true. It is the same instrument used in civil litigation, in property transactions, in immigration cases. The signing of a false affidavit is a criminal offence under the laws of every state in the Union. It is not a casual document. It is a document that the law treats seriously and that the person signing it understands to be a binding statement. Between 1989 and 2002, the researchers Kevin Randall, Donald Schmidt, Tom Carey, Don Berliner, and Stanton Friedman, working separately and sometimes in collaboration, collected sworn affidavits from over 70 individuals who claimed first-hand knowledge of the events of the first week of July 1947. These affidavits are held today in various collections. The largest single deposit is in the files of the Fund for UFO Research, the records of which are now archived at the Center for UFO Studies in Chicago, founded by the astronomer J. Allen Hynek, who had himself served as a scientific consultant to Project Blue Book. The affidavits describe several recurring details. A debris field on the Foster Ranch, material that could not be cut. Bodies between 3 and 4 feet tall, recovered from a site separate from the debris field. Bodies stored in a hangar at the Roswell Army Air Field. Bodies eventually transported by C-54 transport aircraft in wooden crates to Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio. Military personnel sworn to silence, told that if they ever spoke, they would be eliminated and their families would be eliminated. The pattern of these claims is consistent across witnesses who, in many cases, did not know each other and who gave their statements independently, in different decades, in different states, sometimes to different researchers. We are going to examine 3 of these affidavits. The first is from a man who, in 1947, was a major and the provost marshal of the Roswell Army Air Field, in charge of base security. The second is from a mortician in Roswell, and the third is from the man who signed the original press release. Let us begin with the provost marshal. Major Edwin D. Easley was, in July of 1947, the chief of military police at the Roswell Army Air Field. He was responsible for security on the base. He was responsible, by his own later account, for the security of whatever was brought back from the Foster Ranch in those first days of July. Easley was interviewed by Kevin Randall in 1989 and 1990. The recordings of those interviews, along with Easley's later signed statement, are preserved in the Randall Papers at the Center for UFO Studies. In the interviews, Easley would not describe what he had seen. He used a specific phrase, repeatedly. He had been sworn to secrecy. He had given his word. He would not break it. But he said one thing. Randall asked him, on tape, whether what he had been involved in securing in July of 1947 was a weather balloon. Easley laughed. He said, and the recording's unambiguous, that it had not been a weather balloon. He said that whoever was telling Randall it was a weather balloon was not telling the truth. He would not say what it was. He said only that the official explanation was incorrect, and that the truth was something he would carry to his grave. Easley died in 1992. His daughter Nancy Strickland gave a follow-up account to Randall and Schmidt in the years after her father's death. In that account, she said that her father, in the final weeks of his life, in the morphine intervals of late-stage cancer, had spoken without his usual reserve. He had described, she said, what he called the creatures. This is one account. From one daughter, of one deathbed conversation. It is in the record. It is not in a peer-reviewed journal. It is in the files of an investigation conducted by a private researcher. It is testimony that cannot be cross-examined. But it sits, in the file, beside the recorded interview of a senior military police officer who would not deny that the official explanation was false. Let us turn to the second affidavit. Glenn Dennis was, in 1947, a 22-year-old mortician at Ballard Funeral Home in Roswell, and the funeral home held the contract for handling deceased Air Force personnel from the base. Dennis gave his account, in increasing detail, beginning in 1989. He said that on the afternoon of the 7th of July 1947, he had received 3 telephone calls from the mortuary officer at the base. The officer, he said, had asked specific questions. How many child-sized, hermetically sealed caskets could the funeral home provide on short notice? How would a body that had been left in the desert sun for several days be best preserved? How to prepare a body that had not been previously embalmed? Dennis said that, later that afternoon, he had driven to the base to deliver an injured airman to the base hospital. While there, he said, he had encountered a nurse he knew who had been in distress. The nurse, he said, had told him that she had been present at the autopsy of small bodies, bodies with large eyes, bodies with small features, bones described as flexible. The nurse, he said, had been named Naomi Self. Now here, we need to stop and acknowledge what the documentary record shows. In the 1990s, Kevin Randall and Carl Flock, working independently, searched the records of the United States Cadet Nurse Corps for a Naomi Self. They searched the personnel rosters of the Roswell Army Air Field for July of 1947. They searched the records of the bases to which she was supposedly transferred. They found no nurse by that name. Glenn Dennis's account, in its details about the nurse, is not corroborated by the documentary record. This is important to say plainly. Some part of his testimony is, at best, mistaken. At worst, fabricated. Randall himself, by the late 1990s, had concluded that Dennis was not a reliable witness. He has said so in print, on his blog, and in interviews. Carl Flock, the most rigorous of the skeptical investigators, reached the same conclusion in his 2001 book. But notice what they did not conclude. They did not conclude that the body recovery did not happen. They concluded that Dennis's specific story about the nurse could not be confirmed. They left open the question of what happened at the funeral home that afternoon. They left open the question of why a mortuary officer at a base with no children stationed on it would, on a Monday afternoon in July of 1947, be asking about the availability of child-sized, hermetically sealed caskets. The record on Dennis is a record of partial discrediting. It is not a record of total dismissal. And in the careful reading of the Roswell archive, those two things are not the same. Now let us come to the third affidavit. The one that, more than any other single document, has anchored the body recovery question in the past 20 years. Walter G. Haut was the public information officer of the 509th Bombardment Group in July of 1947. He was the man who, on the morning of the 8th of July, took the dictation from Colonel Blanchard and typed the press release that announced the recovery of a flying disc. He carried that release in person to the offices of KGFL and KSWS Radio in Roswell, and to the Associated Press and United Press wire offices. His was the only signature on the document. He was, in the phrase later used by the historians who interviewed him, the man who put Roswell in the world's newspapers. Haut lived a long public life in Roswell. He became a real estate agent. He served on the city council. In 1991, he co-founded the International UFO Museum and Research Center in downtown Roswell, in the building that had once been the Plains Theatre. He gave hundreds of interviews over the course of his life. In every one of them, he held the same line. He had typed the press release. He had been ordered to do so. He had not personally seen the debris. He had not seen any bodies. This was his public position for 55 years. In December of 2002, 3 years before his death, Walter Haut signed a sealed affidavit before a notary public. The affidavit was witnessed by his daughter Julie Schuster, who was at the time the director of the UFO museum he had co-founded. The document was placed in his safe, with the instruction that it not be opened until after his death. Haut died on the 15th of December 2005. The affidavit was opened. It was published in full in 2007 in the book Witness to Roswell by Thomas Carey and Donald Schmidt. The full text is available today in multiple online archives. The original is held in the family papers. In that affidavit, Walter Haut described things he had never spoken of publicly. He wrote that on the morning of the 8th of July 1947, before he typed the press release, he had attended a staff meeting in the office of Colonel Blanchard. Present at that meeting were Colonel Blanchard himself, Major Marcel, Sheridan Cavett, the Counterintelligence Corps officer, who had accompanied Marcel to the debris field, and several other officers. He wrote that on the conference table in Blanchard's office that morning, there were pieces of metallic debris. He described them in the affidavit in the same terms Marcel had used: foil that returned to shape, beam material that could not be marked. But he wrote one thing more. He wrote that later that day, after he had typed the press release and after the wire services had picked it up, Colonel Blanchard had personally driven him out to one of the hangars on the base. The hangar, he wrote, was Building 84. Inside Building 84, he wrote, was an object. He described it as approximately 12 to 15 feet long, 6 feet high, egg-shaped. There were no windows, he wrote, no portholes, no visible seams or rivets. And he wrote that he had seen, in that hangar, on that afternoon, 2 bodies. The bodies, he wrote, were partially covered with a tarpaulin. They were approximately 4 feet tall. The heads, he wrote, were disproportionately large. This is the affidavit of Walter G. Haut, signed before a notary, witnessed by his daughter, sealed in a safe, opened 3 years later on his death. The man who, on the morning of the 8th of July 1947, had typed the press release that announced the recovery of a flying disc had, 55 years later, on his own initiative, signed a sworn statement describing what the press release had not described. Now here is the response that has been made to the Haut affidavit, and we need to set it down clearly. The sceptical position, articulated by Carl Flock and others, is that Walter Haut at the end of his life was an elderly man who had spent decades inside a story that had grown into a regional industry, and who may not have been a reliable narrator of his own memories in his final years. The affidavit in this reading reflects what Haut had come to believe, but not necessarily what he had originally seen. The reading notes that Haut's public statements during his decades of lucid middle age had consistently said he saw nothing. The end-of-life reversal, in this view, is a function of memory, of suggestion, of 50 years of being asked the same question. This is a serious reading. It is not unreasonable, but it is not in itself evidence that the affidavit is false. It is a hypothesis about why a sworn statement might be unreliable. The statement itself, the document signed before a notary, witnessed by family, sealed in a safe, opened on death, remains in the record. What we can say, with confidence, is that the man who signed the original press release on the 8th of July 1947 signed a second document 55 years later that described what the first document had concealed. Now let us turn to the Air Force's response, because the Air Force did respond, and the response is, in its own way, one of the strangest documents in the entire file. In June of 1997, on the eve of the 50th anniversary of the events, the United States Air Force released a 130-page report titled The Roswell Report, Case Closed. The full text is publicly available, archived today as Project Gutenberg ebook number 63659 at gutenberg.org. The principal author was Captain James McAndrew. The report's stated purpose was to address the witness accounts of bodies that the 1994 Air Force balloon report had not addressed. The 1997 report proposed a single explanation. The bodies that witnesses described, the report argued, were anthropomorphic test dummies. Specifically, the dummies used in 2 Air Force high-altitude parachute test programs, Project High Dive and Project Excelsior. These programs, conducted over the New Mexico desert, had used articulated dummies to test parachute systems for high-altitude bailout. The dummies, in the photographs reproduced in the 1997 report, were dressed in flight suits. They had blank faces. They were dropped from balloons at very high altitude. Their crashed remains were recovered by Air Force teams in unmarked trucks. Witnesses, the report argued, had seen these recovery operations and, over the course of decades, had merged the memory of the dummy recoveries with the memory of the 1947 events. Time, the report suggested, had compressed and confused the recollection. This is the official Air Force position, as of 1997, on the body recovery question. Now let us hold this against the calendar Project High Dive began in 1953. Project Excelsior began in 1959. The Roswell witness accounts describe events in July of 1947. The dummy programs, in the words of the 1997 Air Force report itself, were conducted 6 to 12 years after the events the witnesses are describing. The report addresses this discrepancy in a section that became known among researchers as the time problem. The report's answer is that witnesses can be expected to confuse the dates of memories from decades earlier. That what felt to them like an event of 1947 might, on reflection, have been an event of 1956. That the human memory does not, especially across half a century, reliably preserve chronology. This is, in principle, a position one can take, but notice what it requires. It requires that the witnesses, including a provost marshal, a public information officer who had been writing official documents in 1947, and a mortician who had a documented contractual relationship with the base, all confused events that occurred when they were in their 20s and 30s with events that did not yet exist. It requires that they made this confusion consistently, and it requires that they made this confusion in the same direction, all toward the same year, the year that the Roswell Daily Record had announced the recovery of a flying saucer on its July 8, 1947 front page. The 1997 report concludes that the Roswell case is closed. Consider that phrase. Case closed. It is the language of a homicide detective signing off on a file. It is not the language of a historian. A historian, presented with sworn testimony from multiple uncoordinated witnesses, and an official explanation that requires those witnesses to be wrong about which decade they lived through, would not write the words "case closed" on the cover. A historian would leave the file open. The 1997 report did not. Major Edwin Easley would have been 56 years old in 1953 when the high dive program began. He would have been retired from active service. He would not have been the provost marshal of an active base. The dummies, when they crashed, would not have been his responsibility. We can hold this thought as we read forward, but the witnesses are not the only document. Let us turn to the paper trail, the internal documents, the memos that were written at the time by people who were inside the national security apparatus, and who, in 1947, had no reason to assume that anyone outside their offices would ever read them. Let us begin with the document that the FBI itself preserved. On the 8th of July 1947, the same day Walter Haut typed his press release in Roswell, a teletype was sent from the Dallas field office of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The teletype is reproduced in the 1995 General Accounting Office report. The original is preserved in the FBI Vault, the Bureau's public digital archive at vault.fbi.gov. The teletype confirms that the Roswell Army Air Field had reported the recovery of a disc-shaped object. It then notes that the 8th Air Force in Fort Worth had subsequently characterized the object as a radar reflector. The teletype itself does not adjudicate which account was true. It records in the cool tone of internal Bureau correspondence that there had been a recovery, that the recovery had been described in two different ways within a single day, and that the FBI was tracking both descriptions. This is the first document we should set down beside the witness accounts. Not a remembered story, not a deathbed statement. A teletype sent on the day by the FBI to itself. Now let us turn to the second internal document. This one was sent 3 months later. On the 23rd of September 1947, Lieutenant General Nathan F. Twining, commanding officer of the Air Material Command at Wright Field in Dayton, Ohio, sent a memorandum to Brigadier General George F. Shulgan, the chief of the Air Intelligence Requirements Division at the Pentagon. The memo is held in the records of Project Sign, in the National Archives Record Group 341. Its full text has been declassified for decades. It is available online at multiple official archives. The memo is titled AMC Opinion, concerning flying discs. Twining's opinion, summarized in his own opening paragraph, is that the phenomenon is, and here we use his exact phrasing, real and not visionary or fictitious. He further notes that the objects described by witnesses are characterized by extreme rates of climb and maneuverability that would suggest, in his words, either manual, automatic, or remote control. This is the opinion of a 3-star general, written less than 3 months after the Roswell events, to the Office of Air Force Intelligence, on official letterhead, in his official capacity as commander of the Air Materiel Command. The same command that, according to the witness accounts, had taken possession of the Roswell material at Wright Field. The Twining memo does not mention Roswell by name. It does not refer to a specific recovery. It speaks of the phenomenon in the aggregate, as something the Air Materiel Command had been formally asked to assess. And the assessment by the commander of the command was that the phenomenon was real. Now let us turn to the third internal document. On the 22nd of March 1950, Guy Hottel, the special agent in charge of the FBI's Washington field office, sent a memorandum to J. Edgar Hoover, the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The memo is one of the most read documents in the FBI vault. As of the time of this recording, it is one of the most downloaded files the Bureau has ever released. The Hottel memo, in 3 short paragraphs, reports the following: that an Air Force investigator had told the Bureau, in confidence, that 3 flying saucers had been recovered in New Mexico, that the saucers were approximately 50 feet in diameter, that each had contained 3 bodies, of human shape but only 3 feet tall, dressed in metallic cloth of very fine texture, that the investigator believed the saucers had been knocked off course by a high-powered radar in the area. The memo ends there. Now here is what we need to say about the Hottel memo. The FBI itself, in a public statement on its website, has cautioned readers that the memo is a single second-hand account of a story the Bureau itself never independently corroborated, and on which the Bureau took no further action. The FBI does not endorse the contents of the memo, but the FBI did file the memo. The director of the FBI did receive it. It is today, in the official records of the Bureau, in a folder anyone in the world can download. We can hold the FBI's caution and the document's existence in the same hand. They are not in conflict. The document is real. Its contents are unverified. Both statements are true. What is striking when we read it in the context of the Twining memo of 1947 and the FBI teletype of July 8, 1947, is the consistency of the silhouette. A disc, a small body, a recovery in New Mexico. The same outline appears in 3 documents, written in 3 different offices, over 3 different years, by 3 different writers, none of whom, in those 3 documents, were corresponding with each other. Consider that pattern. Then consider the explanation that the witnesses are remembering test dummies from 1953. Now let us turn to the 4th document. This one was not written in 1947, it was written in 1995. In July of 1995, the General Accounting Office of the United States, now the Government Accountability Office, released report number NSIAD 95-187. The report was titled Results of a Search for Records Concerning the 1947 Crash near Roswell, New Mexico. It had been requested by Congressman Stephen Schiff of New Mexico, who, after years of attempting to obtain answers from the Department of Defense about the Roswell incident through ordinary channels, had asked the GAO to conduct a formal records search. The full text of the GAO report is publicly available at GAO. Gavod, the report's findings are, in the careful neutral phrasing of government auditors, profoundly strange. The GAO investigators sought administrative records from the Roswell Army Air Field for the period covering the events of 1947. The administrative records they found did not exist. They had been destroyed. The destruction had occurred at some unspecified date. The records of who had ordered the destruction and under what authority had not been preserved. The investigators sought outgoing message traffic from the Roswell Army Air Field for the period October of 1946 through December of 1949. The outgoing message traffic they found did not exist. It had been destroyed. The destruction had occurred at some unspecified date. The records of who had ordered the destruction and under what authority had not been preserved. Read that paragraph again slowly. The administrative records of the United States Army Airfield that housed in 1947 the only nuclear-armed combat unit on Earth were missing. Not lost, not damaged, destroyed. By unknown personnel, on an unknown date, without an authorizing memorandum. The GAO does not editorialize. The report does not draw conclusions about whether the destruction was related to the events of July 1947. The report simply notes the fact. The records for the period covering the Roswell events are gone. They are gone in a way that the Army's own record retention regulations did not allow. Now, here is the position one might take on this. One could say that record destruction at military bases in the late 1940s was not always orderly, that paperwork was lost, mishandled, misshelved, that the absence of the Roswell-based records is not, in itself, evidence of a cover-up. This is a reasonable thing to say. But notice the specificity of the gap. The records destroyed are precisely the records that would have documented who was at the base in July of 1947, what was reported up the chain of command, what messages were sent to higher headquarters, what dispositions were made of any recovered materials, and which personnel were detached for special assignments. The records that survived are the records that would not, individually, illuminate any of those questions. This is, again, a fact, not an accusation. The GAO investigators, doing their job, recorded that they had asked for these records and that these records did not exist. Their report is dated the 28th of July 1995. It is in the Congressional Record. It is on the GAO website. It is among the most consequential government documents on this case. 3 witnesses spoke to deathbed testimony. 1 affidavit was sealed for 55 years. 3 internal memos describe a recovery, the official statement denied, and the administrative records that would have settled the matter were destroyed, without record, by persons unknown. This is, taken together, the documentary file on the events of July 1947 at the Roswell Army Air Field. It is a file in which the spine has been removed. Now let us widen the frame, because the question we have been holding, in the careful examination of testimony and the careful reading of memos, is not in the end only a question about Roswell. It is a question about what the United States government did on a specific day in July of 1947 and then did not say. And to understand the weight of that question, we need to set it inside a larger pattern. In the years following 1947, the same federal national security apparatus that issued the 8th of July press release and that retracted it that same evening, and that destroyed the base records at some unspecified subsequent date, continued to investigate the phenomenon under classified program names. Project Sign was inaugurated at the Air Materiel Command at Wright Field in January of 1948. Its files are in the National Archives. They include the Twining memo we have just discussed. Project Sign concluded, in its initial estimate of the situation, dated August of 1948, that the most plausible explanation for the credible cases was extraterrestrial. The estimate was prepared by the project staff. It was forwarded up the chain to the Chief of Staff of the Air Force, General Hoyt Vandenberg. General Vandenberg, in a decision recorded in the project's own files, rejected the estimate as unsupportable by the available evidence and ordered it destroyed. The estimate was, in fact, destroyed. The fact of its existence and the fact of its destruction are preserved in the recollections of the Project Sign personnel and in the historical work of Captain Edward Ruppelt, who succeeded the program and wrote about it in his 1956 book, The Report on Unidentified Flying Objects. Ruppelt's book is held in the Library of Congress. Project Sign was reorganized into Project Grudge in February of 1949. Grudge took the position that flying saucers did not exist, and that witness accounts were misidentifications, hoaxes, or psychological events. Project Grudge was reorganized into Project Blue Book in March of 1952. Blue Book ran until December of 1969. Its files, all 12,618 cases, are publicly available today through the National Archives. The publicly available position of the United States Air Force from 1969 forward was that there had been no extraterrestrial visitation, no recovered craft, no recovered bodies. This was the position for 54 years. Then, on the 26th of July 2023, a man named David Charles Grush appeared before the United States House of Representatives. The hearing was conducted by the Subcommittee on National Security, the Border and Foreign Affairs of the Committee on Oversight and Accountability. The official document number is HHRG 118-06 2022-30726. The full video record is available on C-SPAN. Grush had been, until his resignation a few months earlier, a senior intelligence officer with the National Geospatial Intelligence Agency and the National Reconnaissance Office. His clearance level had included compartmented access to classified programs. He had served, by his own testimony, and according to the records that have since been declassified, on the Unidentified Aerial Phenomena Task Force, the predecessor of the office that today is called the All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office. Grush testified under oath before the United States Congress that he had been informed by colleagues with direct knowledge that the United States government had, for decades, operated a classified crash retrieval and reverse engineering program. He testified that the program had recovered, in his exact phrase, non-human biologics. He named no specific incidents. He testified that the names of the relevant programs were classified and that he had referred a detailed account on the record to the Inspector General of the intelligence community, who had found his complaint to be credible and urgent. This was sworn testimony before Congress by a senior intelligence officer with active clearances, less than 2 years before the date on which we sit recording this. The Department of Defense, through its All-Domain Anomaly Resolution Office, has denied Grush's specific allegations. The ARO Historical Record Report, Volume 1, published in 2024 and available at ARO. Mill concludes that none of the allegations of crash retrieval, of reverse engineering, or of non-human biological materials has been substantiated by any documentary or physical evidence that the office could verify. This is, again, a position one can take. The ARO investigation is the most extensive official inquiry into these allegations since Project Blue Book. Its conclusions deserve serious weight, but the testimony itself, the sworn statement before Congress, is now part of the record. Whatever the ARO concludes, the document of the testimony remains. It is in the Library of Congress. It is in the Congressional Record. It is in the C-SPAN archive. It will be there in 100 years. And someone 100 years from now will read it. They will read it in the same way that we, today, read the FBI teletype of the 8th of July, 1947, and the Twining memo of the 23rd of September, 1947, and the Hottel memo of the 22nd of March, 1950. They will read it as a document, filed at the time, by a person inside the system, about something that the official position denied, and they will be left to do what we are left to do tonight, which is to set the documents next to each other and see what they say in each other's company. What they say when read in each other's company is this. There was, in July of 1947, a recovery. The recovery was reported by the Army Air Field that performed it, in writing, on its own letterhead, in a press release that went out over national wires. The recovery was then characterised, that same evening, as a weather instrument. The administrative records that would have documented which of those two characterisations was accurate were, at some unrecorded later date, destroyed. In the years that followed, the same federal apparatus that issued the retraction continued to investigate the phenomenon under classified program names. A 3-star general, in a memo to the Pentagon dated September of 1947, called it real and not visionary. A senior special agent of the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in a memo to the director dated March of 1950, reported on 3 sources and small bodies in metallic cloth. The official public position, on neither date, said either. Almost 8 decades later, a senior intelligence officer told the United States Congress under oath that the recovery had not been an isolated event, that there had been others, that biological material had been retrieved. The Department of Defense formally disputes that testimony. The testimony remains all the same in the record. Now let us set the documents next to each other, as we have been doing throughout. The Roswell Daily Record of the 8th of July, 1947. The FBI Dallas teletype of the same day. The Twining memo of the 23rd of September, 1947. The Hottel memo of the 22nd of March, 1950. The GAO report of the 28th of July, 1995. The Haut sealed affidavit of the 26th of December, 2002, opened in 2007. The Grush testimony of the 26th of July, 2023. 7 documents, spanning 76 years, filed in 7 different offices, by 7 different writers, in 7 different decades. None of them, individually, settles the question. All of them together describe a silhouette. The silhouette is this. A recovery occurred. It was reported. The report was withdrawn. The records were destroyed. The internal correspondence continued, in private, to treat the recovery as a working assumption. The public position, in public, continued to deny it. And the people inside the system, at the moments closest to the end of their service, or at the moment of leaving it, returned, again and again, to the same account. This is what the file says. We can take at this point the position that the file is wrong, that the witness is confabulated, that the documents are misread, that the GAO's finding of missing records is a clerical artifact of a different decade's filing habits, that the Twining memo refers to a generalized phenomenon and not to any specific recovery, that the Hottel memo is a recycled rumor, that Walter Haut, in his last years, was no longer the man who had typed the press release, that David Grush's testimony is unsourced. This is a defensible position. It is in fact the official position. We can hold it. Or we can take the other position, that the witnesses were telling, in the only language they had, the truth, that the documents are what they appear to be, that the records were destroyed because they contained something that someone, at some moment, decided ought not to be read, that the Twining memo means what it says, that the Hottel memo describes what the Bureau was told, that Walter Haut sealed his testimony for the same reason men have always sealed testimony at the end of their lives, that David Grush said, under oath, what he believed he had been told. This is also a defensible position. What we cannot honestly do, having read the file, is dismiss the question. Now let us return to where we began. Picture again the small office in Roswell on the afternoon of the 8th of July 1947. The walls are painted the pale institutional green of military buildings of the period. The window looks out across the tarmac, toward the hangars, where the only nuclear-armed combat unit on Earth keeps its aircraft. First Lieutenant Walter G. Haut, Public Information Officer of the 509th Bombardment Group, 25 years old, is sitting at a typewriter. He has been given a single sheet of paper and a verbal instruction by his commanding officer, Colonel William Blanchard. The instruction is to write a press release. He writes it. He has been writing routine press releases since he took the post. This one is not routine. The text he produces in 3 short paragraphs states that the Intelligence Office of the 509th has come into possession of a flying disc. The disc was recovered from a ranch in the vicinity of Roswell. It has been forwarded to higher headquarters. He pulls the page from the typewriter. He hands it to a runner. The runner delivers copies to the 2 Roswell radio stations and to the wire services. Within hours, the story is on the front page of the Roswell Daily Record. Within hours after that, the wire services have moved it nationwide. By that evening in Fort Worth, the same press has been told that the disc was a weather balloon. Walter Haut, in the small office at Roswell, did not know any of that would happen. He typed what he was told to type. He filed his copy. He went home. He would live another 58 years. He would marry. He would raise a daughter. He would, in 1991, help to found the International UFO Museum and Research Center in the town, where he had typed the press release. He would, on the 26th of December 2002, place his right hand on a sheet of paper in front of a notary, sign his name, and seal a different account inside an envelope to be opened at his death. The envelope was opened in 2007. The press release of July 8th is on microfilm at the University of New Mexico Center for Southwest Research. The affidavit of December 26, 2002 is in the records of the museum on Main Street in Roswell. The 2 documents signed by the same hand, 55 years apart, do not agree. That is the file. 1 man, 2 papers. Both still there. Both still being read. Now let us pause here for a moment. The records survived. Someone preserved them. The Roswell Daily Record kept its microfilm. The University of New Mexico kept the microfilm safe. The FBI kept its teletype. And then, decades later, scanned it and posted it on the open web. The National Archives kept the Twining memo. The University of Texas at Arlington kept Bond Johnson's negatives. The General Accounting Office published its 1995 report on a public server, where any person, anywhere, can download it. The C-SPAN archive kept the video of the 2023 hearing. The Haut family opened the envelope, and a private museum in a small city in New Mexico keeps the affidavit today. Almost everything that, by the ordinary entropy of paperwork in a mid-century federal agency, ought to have vanished without trace, was somehow not vanished. The records that were destroyed are a specific, narrow set. Almost everything else was kept. Consider that, for a moment, as a fact about how the historical record actually works. Things survive by accident. Things survive because a stenographer made a carbon. Things survive because an officer in 1947 filed a unit history that nobody, decades later, thought to redact. Things survive because a man at the end of his life signed a paper and asked his daughter to keep it. Things survived because the Federal Bureau of Investigation, in the years before the photocopier and the shredder, was a bureaucracy that filed everything in triplicate. The story we have inherited on this one event, in this one corner of one desert, in one summer of one year, was not constructed deliberately by any single hand. It was assembled, document by document, decade by decade, by the small accidents of preservation. And what the documents say, when assembled, is that something happened. We do not know with certainty what. We do not know with finality by whom. We do not know what was recovered, or where it was taken, or what was done with it. We know that the people closest to the event, in the moments closest to their deaths, returned to the same account. We know that the records that would have settled the question are missing. We know that the official position has been refined 3 times, in 3 reports over 5 decades, and that each refinement has been issued under pressure, in response to questions that would not stop being asked. This is what the file says. What I keep coming back to is the press release. I have read it many times. The text is short, the language is plain, the sentences do not strain to be believed. They simply state, in the way a public information officer in 1947 would have stated, that the 509th had come into possession of a flying disc. I keep thinking about the moment he typed it, not the moment it was retracted, not the moment the records were destroyed, not the deathbed affidavit, just the moment on the afternoon of the 8th of July 1947, when a 25-year-old lieutenant put a sheet of paper into a typewriter and wrote what he had been told to write. He could not have known, in that moment, what the sentence would become. He could not have known that he would be alive to see 58 more years of denial, refinement, retraction, and counterclaim. He could not have known that he would, in the last years of his life, write a second account, in his own hand, and seal it so that no one would have to defend it on his behalf while he was still here to be questioned. He could not have known any of that. He just typed what he was told to type. And then much later, he typed what he believed. Both documents survived him. I do not know, fellow archivist, what to do with this. I have spent more years than I want to count holding these 2 pieces of paper next to each other in my mind. The press release, dated the 8th of July 1947. The affidavit, sealed the 26th of December 2002. The same signature. Almost 6 decades apart, the first written for the world, the second written for after. The official history says the first was the truth, and the second was the failure of an old man's memory. The investigators who interviewed Walter Haut in his last years say very nearly the opposite. There is no test today that can decide between them. What we are left with is the documents themselves. The press release is in the archive. The affidavit is in the archive. The teletype is in the archive. The memos are in the archive. The GAO report is in the archive. The sworn testimony is in the archive. The photographs from Fort Worth, with the unreadable telex in General Ramey's hand, are in the archive. Someone, somewhere, is reading one of them right now. If this story stayed with you, like helps other patient eyes find this archive, there is more waiting for you in the playlist. Other documents, other erasures, other photographs that the standard history does not quite explain. The records survived. Someone, somewhere, kept them. We are reading them again now. Thank you for staying with me through this story. The photograph of General Ramey, in his office at Fort Worth, holding the telex no one can read, is still at the University of Texas at Arlington. The Roswell Daily Record of July 8, 1947, is still on microfilm at the University of New Mexico. The Twining memo is still at the National Archives. The Hottel memo is still at the FBI vault. The GAO report is still on the open web. The Walter Haut affidavit is still in the museum in Roswell. The C-SPAN video of the 2023 hearing is still on the C-SPAN archive. Somewhere, in a small office on a quiet afternoon, in the summer of 1947, a young officer typed a sentence. The sentence said that something had been recovered. The sentence was, within hours, withdrawn. The records that would have told us what to make of the sentence were, at some later date, removed, but the sentence itself was preserved. By microfilm, by the carbon paper of a wire service, by the slow, indifferent care of an archive that did not know at the time what it was keeping. It is still there. The conversation continues,